Dr. McClendon, you can go ahead and kick us off.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gina Gunn McClendon, and I direct the Voter Access and Engagement Initiative at the Center for Social Development in the Brown School. Welcome to Know Your Voting Rights, Information for Civic Health Discussion. This meeting is a part of a series on voting and civic engagement hosted by the Center for Social Development, Gephardt Institute for Civic and Community Engagement, and Campus Election Engagement Project. We have an exciting program today that is designed to provide some guidance on ways to successfully exercise your right to vote. Knowing your voting rights and ways to respond to when you see violations of those rights is not only a way to ensure your and others can fairly cast a vote, it ensures that your voice is heard, and democracy can only thrive when it's practiced and not prevented. Today, Mr. Louis Damani Jones, who is a Gephardt Fellow for Engaged Democracy and a Master Social Work student in the Brown School, will moderate the discussion. Louis, take it away.
Thanks so much. We are honored to have Denise Lieberman with us. Denise Lieberman is a civil rights lawyer, general counsel to the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, which is a nonpartisan statewide network of voter advocates. As a nationally recognized voting rights expert, she is currently counsel of record on several cases challenging aspects of absentee and mail-in ballot rules to ensure that all voters are able to safely cast a ballot in the November 2020 elections. Denise, I would love if you could go ahead and share what you have to share with us today.
Thank you so much, Louis, and thank you, Dr. McClendon, and thank you to the Gephardt Institute, and thank you especially to the Voter Access and Engagement Initiative and all of the tremendous work that all of you are doing, both on campus and off campus in the community to ensure that all voters are able to cast a ballot. And I'm so proud of the Washington University community for the work that you're doing in the community, both to make sure that students on campus are able to exercise their right to vote, but bringing the brilliance and the research and the resources of WashU to the broader community itself. And that's really tremendous. So I'm incredibly proud to be here today, and proud to be a fellow WashUian. I am an adjunct professor of political science and law at Washington University, and I teach courses on voting rights and election law and impact litigation and civil rights. So I'm particularly thrilled to be here with my colleagues and all of you. So I'm here today. We're only a few days away from Election Day. Right? Just a few days more, but who's counting? And we're going to talk today about how we can ensure that our voices are all heard, and just talk about some key issues that we're tracking with respect to voting in Missouri on Election Day. So as Louis mentioned, the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition is a nonpartisan statewide network of voter advocacy organizations that include Washington University. It includes not specifically the Voter Access and Engagement Initiative, but we also have student group participation from various colleges and universities around the state. So I highly encourage you to get involved. It's a really robust coalition made up of about 50 or so organizational partners that, again, represent everything from...
Turn that off. Are you serious?
Whoops. Oh, we might have some background noise here. That represent everything from community groups, civic engagement groups, racial justice organizations, disability access organizations, senior advocacy groups, student advocacy groups, and more. And we're actually a year-round program because working to protect the right to vote doesn't just happen on Election Day. And we undertake our work through sort of 4 buckets of work, including policy advocacy. So we help track and analyze voting-related legislation in the Missouri legislature as well as in Congress, and provide that analysis to coalition partners. We undertake legal advocacy and litigation. And so, as Luce mentioned, we were involved in as counsel of record in 2 lawsuits on behalf of Black and faith-led and social justice organizations to ensure all voters have safe access to absentee mail-in voting during this pandemic. We undertake education and engagement, like programs like this one. And our signature program, which is the Election Protection Program. And this is a nonpartisan effort that we undertake in Missouri in collaboration with national election protection partners. And so I do want to just give a shout out to the program that we're having this week, because this is National Disrupt Disinformation Week. And so this is a really great time to make sure that you're on top of what the voting rules are in your state, and to help make sure that the people around you have access to accurate information, and to help prevent the spread of misinformation. So the first thing that we encourage people to do, of course, is make a voting plan. And this will include making decisions about how it's going to work for you to be able to cast a ballot. Do you need to vote remotely through the mail? That may be a little challenging right now. The deadline to request a ballot through the mail has already passed. And unless you're voting absentee, where you can return those ballots in the mail, in person, it's really also even getting too late to return remote ballots through the mail. So you may want to consider that second option. If you qualify to vote absentee, if you don't want to go vote at the polls on election day, if you're concerned about that, if you qualify to vote absentee, you can do that in person at your local election authority office anytime through 5 p.m. on Monday, November 2nd, including on Saturday. They're going to have Saturday hours this weekend. And if you are someone that is going to vote on election day, also make a plan about that ahead of time. Double check where your polling place is located, because it may have changed. We've seen a lot of polling place closures amid the COVID pandemic. Think about what time you're going to go to try to avoid long lines. If you can go outside of some of the peak times are right when the polls first open at 6 a.m. And the last several hours, like 5 to 7, before the polls close. If you can go sometime more in the middle of the day, you're less likely to face lines at the polls. And if you have any questions whatsoever, I'm just putting this up at the outset, please call the Election Protection Hotline at 866-OUR-VOTE. You can call or text that number and get a response. That's 866-687-8683. And in fact, it is live right now. Attorneys answer these calls. They can do everything from answer routine questions like, where is my polling place? Or is my registration up to date? To more complex issues about if you're being denied the right to vote, or if you're witnessing or experiencing any intimidation or disruptions at your polling place, or any sort of questions in between. The great thing about this program is that, like I said, we are doing this in collaboration with national partners, and we've got a host of voting rights expertise involved in this process. And here in Missouri, we do have a national call center. And what that means is that if you call 866-OUR-VOTE from Missouri, you're going to be talking to an attorney right here in Missouri who knows the rules, who's going to be able to help you figure out what your how to answer your question, and how to help advocate for your right to vote. On top of that, this legal hotline is really complemented by a robust ground program that we'll have going on all over the state as well. We have over 1,300 people signed up to help monitor the polls all across the state of Missouri on Election Day, including hundreds right here in the St. Louis area. And that is complemented by people who are helping monitor people's questions as well as misinformation online. So again, that number is 866-OUR-VOTE. And if you don't want to call or text that number, there's also a chat function. You can go to 866ourvote.org and click on the chat icon and ask your questions that way. There are also tons of resources at 866ourvote.org. You just click on the Missouri part of the map and you'll get all the Missouri resources, Missouri FAQs and top issues and other things that we're going to be talking about. I should let you know that we also have hotlines that are available to speak to voters in other languages, which is really important to ensure full accessibility for all voters, including limited English proficiency voters. So there's a Spanish English hotline, an Asian languages hotline, and an Arabic language hotline as well that are sponsored by some of our national coalition partners. And like I said, this program is really robust. In addition to, I think we have over 300 attorneys signed up here in Missouri. We will have tons of monitors at polling places across the state that will be tracking information at the polls and will be available to answer any questions that you might have if you're at the polling place. We're also going to have roving monitors who will be driving from poll to poll in their cars, who will be branded with election protection car magnets, who will also be tracking conditions at the polls and be available for rapid response as issues come into the hotline. We're going to be able to be responsive as complaints come in, as we're hearing about things at particular polling places, and send roving deputies to those places. And finally, we're going to have lots more signage to make sure everybody knows that there is a place that they can call to get immediate help on election day. And that's really sort of a big part that is so great about this program, is that it is immediate assistance. So if you're at a polling place or you're about to head out to vote, or if you're going to go vote absentee and you're experiencing any issues, you're going to talk to someone right then and there. Because we know that, especially for people that may have had a bad experience or told they can't vote, if they leave and first try and figure out what happened, the likelihood of them returning and trying to exercise their ballot is very, very low. So being able to provide immediate assistance in real time, we're like, hey, we're going to fix this right here and now. We got a lawyer who's going to stay on the phone with you until you get to vote, is really powerful. And if you're interested in helping with this effort, there are still volunteer opportunities, and you can sign up to volunteer at protectthevote.net. And if you do that, you'll get some information about next steps in that process. Most of our trainings have been completed. We do have another training this weekend, but we did record all those trainings. So even late joiners will have the ability to watch the recorded trainings and have access to the materials. So what I really wanted to spend some time on today are kind of key issues that we're focusing on Election Day, and in particular things that that folks on this call might be particularly interested in. You know, there's lots of issues that voters confront every election cycle, but we know that 2020 is definitely unique, to say the least. And, you know, we are in a space of just heightened political tension that's already got people got people's nerves on end. People are anxious. People are worried. People are concerned. People are confused. And this is sort of complemented by the spate of new laws on the books, lawsuits and legal challenges out there, the COVID-19 pandemic that has upended really every aspect of our lives, including voting and elections, means that so many people are casting ballots in different ways and new ways for the first time. Here in Missouri, we've got a brand new law in the books that means that some people are casting ballots under very new rules that they're not used to. Polling places have closed because of COVID. In St. Louis County, there's only going to be about half the polling places that there were in the last general election. And all of this is exacerbated by worries and concerns that people have about conditions they may face at the polls. Misinformation, intimidation, disruptive poll watchers, and more. So let's just dig right in. The first issue that I want to talk about is sort of a perennial one, but it bears noting. Make sure that you double check your voter registration, because the last thing you want to do is show up and be told that your name's not on the voter rolls. So you can check that at sos.mo.gov. In addition, be on the lookout if you have not already received a postcard like this in the mail if you're registered to vote in Missouri. These cards go out to every registered voter in advance of Election Day. So the good news is that if you got this in the mail, that means you are on the list of registered voters. The other great thing about this card is it tells you where your polling place is. And so your polling place might have changed. I know mine did, and I was voting at the same place for like 20 years. But it was a grade school, and it was not a very good place to have polling during the middle of a pandemic. It's now been moved to an abandoned school that is not operating as a grade school. The next thing I want to sort of talk through is what to know about mail and absentee voting. So many people want to vote outside of Election Day this year because of the pandemic, because of concerns about long lines, concerns about crowds, just concerns about overall confusion at the polling place. So like I said at the outset, it's currently too late to request a ballot through the mail. But if you qualify to vote absentee for any reason, and here are the reasons, you can go do that in person. You can do that in person at your local election authority office. And if you are in the St. Louis metro area, which I think most of you are, if you live in St. Louis City, you'd go down to 300 North Tucker or one of the satellite locations. There's satellite locations at a variety of local libraries in different parts of town. And if you are in St. Louis County, for example, if you live in University City or Clayton, you would go to St. Louis County. Their headquarters is in Northwest Plaza, but they also have a series of satellite locations, including one in Clayton that's very close to campus that you can vote absentee in person. And again, that's going to be available this Saturday on Halloween, all the way through 5 p.m. on Monday. Now, if you requested and got an absentee ballot in the mail or a mail-in ballot, what's important to know about these is that they need to be returned to your local election authority by Election Day. And some of them are going to need to be notarized. If you need help finding a notary, you can go visit. There's a number of sites, a number of community groups that are offering notarizations, and I know that there are efforts on campus as well to help with this. You can also visit notaryhub.movpc.org. But you also have the option of voting on Election Day. So if you know people who got a ballot in the mail or who requested a ballot in the mail and never got it, and maybe you got it but you didn't get a chance to turn it back in, like I said, I think at this point it's a little late to put things in the mail to guarantee they'll be received by Election Day. You may want to go vote at the polls, and that's okay. So the deal with this is if you requested a ballot through the mail, but you never returned it, you never got it sent in and processed, well, you're still eligible to vote because you don't have a recorded vote attached to your voter registration. So if you requested but never received a ballot, or if you received a ballot but lost it, don't have it, just go to your polling place. And in St. Louis County, you can vote at any polling location in the county. You'll tell them, they'll have you on a list. They'll say, oh, you requested an absentee ballot. You could say, I never got it, or I lost it. You will complete a form saying that you don't have it and vote a regular ballot. Now, if you did get that thing in the mail, but you never got a chance to turn it back in, maybe you couldn't find a notary, maybe the clock just is ticking and you're really scared at this point about putting it in the mail or going down to return it in person, you can spoil that ballot at the polls. You can surrender it. So you can't turn in a completed ballot at the polls. This part is a little confusing, but you can kind of give the whole thing up. You can surrender it. They'll take it, in essence, kind of tear it up, and then you start over. You just vote a regular ballot at the polls like you would regularly. Another big question that we get on election day is IDs. And this is a perennial issue of confusion in Missouri because Missouri lawmakers have been trying very hard for the last 16 years to implement strict photo ID requirements to vote in the state. And we keep suing them, and the courts keep telling them, no, you can't do that. And now the issue is settled. The Missouri Supreme Court has spoken. A photo ID is not required to vote. You do have to show one form of ID, but it can be any of these forms listed here on this slide. And it can even be a student ID from Washington University. As long as it's a student ID from any college or university located in Missouri, you're good to go. You can also show that postcard that you got in the mail from the election board that we talked about earlier. You can also show a driver's license, and it doesn't have to be a driver's license from Missouri. So if you're originally from another state and you still got that driver's license, but you're now registered here, that is also a valid form of ID that you can use. The final thing I want to say on this is students, college students cannot be made to show additional forms of ID. We've had these sorts of complaints before where sometimes college students get a little extra scrutiny if they try and show their student ID and are told, oh, well, you're going to need to present something on top of that. No, you don't. One ID. Any registered voter in Missouri only needs to show one of these things. And if you don't have any ID at all, you can cast a provisional ballot. So I want to talk very briefly about issues of accessibility, in part because this affects a lot of voters. More than 35 million Americans have some type of disability that could affect their ability to access the polls. And we're hearing a lot of stories about concerns that people have, both because of COVID, because of long lines, because of some of the conditions at polling places, about being able to access the vote. There are lots of federal laws, including these I've listed here on the right, that ensure all voters are able to access a ballot. And Missouri law guarantees this as well. You may not know this, but if you need help for any reason, reading or casting your ballot, you have a right to help. Poll workers can help you, or you can bring in anybody you want. And the reason that you need help cannot be scrutinized. So you may have difficulty reading your ballot if you have a visual impairment. But you also might need help reading that ballot if you have dyslexia, or if you have limited English proficiency, or if you have low literacy. And you don't need to tell that poll worker which one of those things it is, just that you need help and you're entitled to it. This, by the way, is also true for people that have limited English proficiency that need help translating their ballots. They can bring somebody in. Voters are also entitled to vote curbside. And this is an issue we're hearing a lot about, and something we're very concerned is available to all voters this year. Any voter who has physical barriers to going into the polling place or standing in line is entitled to vote curbside. They simply need to alert a poll worker that they need a ballot brought out to their car, and anybody can do that on their behalf. So if you happen to be at a polling place and you see somebody pull up that needs help, you are allowed to go in and say, hey, there's a lady in a red Toyota outside who needs curbside voting. And they have to come bring them a ballot in a timely fashion. Again, all voters, regardless of their physical abilities, are entitled to cast a ballot. And this is true regardless of whether the person has a visible disability. We've had some pushback sometimes with poll workers going, well, you're not in a wheelchair. Well, we don't know what other conditions that person might have, right? I mean, the person could have gait or balance issues. The person might have cerebral palsy and have real challenges navigating certain types of terrain. And for some people, it might be contextual. So like people like my mother, who's 89, she walks with a walker. She has arthritis. Some days she walks better than others. Other days she's in quite a bit of pain and can barely stand up. And for some people, you know, if there's no line and there's no steps, they can get in okay. But if there's a long line, maybe not so much. Maybe that's not something they can stand in. It's up to the voter to decide if they need help, and they're entitled to it. So the final thing I want to jump in on, because I'm sure people are going to want to talk about this, is misinformation and intimidation. And this includes everything from stuff that you see online to just things that are just outright wrong, things that are deceptive, things that are confusing, as well as overt behavior at the polling place that either disrupts the polling place, impedes the ability of voters to come in and out, or is intimidating. And we are entering this election in a context of misinformation this year. There's just so much noise out there. And for those of you who are able to help volunteer with us to help combat some of that, I do encourage you to sign up to be a social media monitor and help us ferret some of this stuff out online. But one of the best things that we can do is all just take a deep breath before we start reposting things. Stop and think, do you know where you got that information? Are you sure it's true in Missouri? The voting rules differ from state to state. And so just because your friend in another state may have sent you something, and it very well may be true where they're from, it might not be true in Missouri. So we are really asking people to take a step back, stop before you share any information, and make sure that you got it from a trusted source and that it's accurate here in Missouri. Again, don't ever hesitate to call 866-OUR-VOTE with any questions you might have. So let's talk about what can happen at the polls on Election Day. I know people are really worried about this. And with good measure, we know that there are plans to have lots of people at the polls watching the polls, and that there are lots of partisan interests involved in this, some of which might benefit from disrupting activity at the polls. And I'll just step back and say political parties have always had watchers at the polling places, but there's definitely an uptick in expectation of what we're likely to see this year. And there's also concern that people sort of not political operatives, but perhaps vigilante folks or just other folks are going to also show up at the polls with the intent to disrupt things. You may recollect that President Trump, during the first presidential debate, was asked by Chris Wallace whether he would agree to a peaceful transition of power, and he pivoted to calling on his supporters to show up at the polls and watch. And he did that within the same conversation that he referenced the Proud Boys. And that's led to concerns that there could be people showing up at polling places intent on disrupting or intimidating voters. And we know from past experience that when these activities occur, they do tend to target communities of color, particularly African American and Latino communities, who are most likely to already face additional barriers to the ballot. So what I want to tell you here right now is voter intimidation, misleading information, anything that is disorderly at the polling place, or anything that impedes the ability of voters to vote is illegal under state law and under federal law. That includes challenges that are not based in evidence to a voter's eligibility, anything that intimidates voters, the spreading of false information, anything that interferes with a voter at a polling place, and even police presence if it is present in a way that is intimidating towards voters, anything that's targeted to the voter. So I want to just step back and share with you sort of who can be at the polls. And there's two types of folks that can be there. Some inside and some outside. So first I want to say the law really limits who can be inside of a polling place to people who are there to vote. Makes sense. Poll workers. Makes sense. Some international observers and academics. And challengers who are designated by a political party. Now the political parties are calling these folks poll watchers a lot this year because it sounds a little bit nicer than challengers, but technically what they're allowed to do is challenge a voter's eligibility. And so sort of legally they're referred to as challengers. But there are rules. The political parties have to, they have to be registered to vote in the jurisdiction. The political parties have to submit their names ahead of time. They have to wear credentials when they're inside the polls, and they cannot talk to voters. They can challenge a voter's eligibility, but they cannot talk to the voter. And they can't disrupt the process either. Like, they can't just sit there and like chit chat or like just be sort of overly present in a way that impedes people's ability to get timely processed, you know? Outside the polls is a little bit different matter. There's no real regulation of who can be outside the polls. Obviously, the First Amendment gives a lot of us the right to engage in free speech and be there, and certainly polling places on Election Day are quite the experiment in American democracy. There's all kinds of political speech taking place. So what that means is pretty much anybody can be there, but there are some rules. One, in Missouri, we have a 25-foot buffer zone. That means nobody can be closer than 25 feet to the door. That's designed to give voters just some breathing room, like that they're entitled to clear passage to get in and out of the polls without being inundated by people. So that's going to be true whether you're there handing out political literature or you're there doing something else. No one can be 25 feet. No one can block entrances or exits. So voters should not have to like sort of scoot around someone's truck or banner or have to kind of traverse really loud noises or things like that. They also cannot intimidate voters. So what's intimidating? What's voter intimidation? It's anything that makes a voter feel intimidated. So that may differ from place to place. You know, for example, let's just use police presence. In wealthy white communities, the presence of a police officer, an armed police officer at a polling place might be seen as a source of comfort. But in communities of color that have been persecuted by police in places like Ferguson, maybe not so much. That might be seen as a source of intimidation. So context really matters, and what they're doing matters. I do want to say that the laws are very serious. The Voting Rights Act makes it illegal to intimidate voters, and these are serious crimes. Voter intimidation is a 5-year felony. 2 or more people conspire, agreeing to do that is a 10-year felony. Any sort of violence is at minimum a 10-year felony. So this is pretty serious stuff. And in Missouri, our local laws also make any kind of impeding of the polling place illegal. And it also prevents this electioneering within 25 feet of the polling place as well. So what I want to say 2 more things on this, and I want to open it up because I think we're getting close on time here. So first off, I want to mention guns. Missouri is an open carry state. That means people are legally allowed to openly carry guns. If they're legally registered, right? However, just because that is a right does not mean that it can be done in a way that is intimidating to voters. So again, just like people have a right to free speech, people here have a right to open carry. Neither of those things can be exercised in a way that is intimidating to voters. So it's going to depend on context. We really encourage people not to engage if they see agitators at the polls. Agitators are there for the purpose. They want you to engage, like they're there for the purpose of agitating. There are resources to respond to them. The Missouri Voter Protection Coalition and Election Protection, we've already sat down with the FBI, with the police, with the U.S. Attorney's Office, with the Hate Crimes Task Force. There are people who are trained on how to deal with folks who are agitators and can address these situations. We don't believe that calling the police should be the first answer to anything, but we know in some cases that might be necessary. The final thing I want to say, because I know this may affect students a lot, with respect to electioneering and intimidation. So electioneering is supporting any candidate or ballot measure. And so you can't do that inside a polling place or within 25 feet. So what that means is you can't wear political garb inside a polling place, including t-shirts or hats. However, there are lots of disputes about what constitutes political garb. The answer is anything that advocates or suggests that people support a particular candidate or a particular ballot measure. So we've had people, for example, in the past, our election protection volunteers who show up with t-shirts that say election protection, told they can't wear that inside a polling place. That is untrue. Election protection, there is no suggestion. In fact, we are overtly nonpartisan. We have to be nonpartisan in order to ensure that all voters are able to cast a ballot. We legally cannot support any candidate or ballot measure. And so just a shirt that says election protection itself is not overtly political. Now, what we're seeing in other states is in particular concern about statement t-shirts. For example, Black Lives Matter. It is our position that just like election protection, people who are wearing a t-shirt that says Black Lives Matter are not overtly, it's not associated with a particular candidate or ballot measure. The message you send when you wear Black Lives Matter is simply that you believe that Black Lives Matter. And it's not a PAC. It doesn't support any particular candidate or ballot issue. And so that should not constitute electioneering. In contrast, Make America Great Again hats, those are directly associated as the logo of an actual candidate on the ballot. So that could be prohibited. I think that's really what I want to stop with right there. And I want to just open it up to questions and discussion. I think Louis may have some questions about things that you're concerned about, that other students are concerned about, things that you're hearing. Let's just open it up to whatever people want to talk about. And again, just as a final push, at the end of the day, any questions at all, please call 866-OUR-VOTE. Oh, and the final thing I do want to say, again, if you're interested at all in learning more about the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition or getting emails from us that often include links to nice talking points and fact sheets and stuff, you can text MOVPC to 66866.
That was an amazing, very thorough presentation. I'm so appreciative for that, because so many of the questions that are raised often you addressed in your presentation. Obviously, you are professional, and you and you gave an amazing overview there. When some of the questions that people talk about is like that you addressed, I'm just going to go through, are questions about voting. Obviously now that we have moved into this kind of in-time phase, if you will, of the voting process, some ways that Missourians could vote in the past are no longer really options for them at this point, potentially. So you addressed that, talking about how some absentee in-person services are available for voting, and some also obviously on election day itself. One question you definitely addressed, I believe, was for those who have requested a ballot and not received that ballot, can they go in person? Maybe they, like you said before, they couldn't somehow get it notarized, or some type of thing happened that barred them from utilizing it in that way. Could they still vote? And you answered that question. That was one of our CS questions as well. And then voter suppression. Obviously, we're living in an unprecedented time of misinformation and, obviously the classic voter suppression tactics. But then, of course, it's ramped up, and there's some questions even about international voter suppression, international misinformation. And so many people have those concerns, even on social media. How can I navigate this? What is my responsibility here? How do I know what's a valid source of information? And so you kind of touched on that as well. But I would ask on that point, do you have any more thoughts to share about misinformation and voter suppression? It's such a big question now. And how do we see if some information is accurate information, or how do we know it's safe to share?
That's such a great question. And honestly, it just gets right to the heart of so much of the intersection of so much of what is going on this year, because there's just so much noise out there. You know, first off, see where you got it from. Do you know the person that sent it? And do you know the organization involved? Is it labeled with an organization's logo or information? Is it a trusted source? You know, election protection has been around a long time. It's a trusted source of accurate, valid information. The Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, Washington University. If you see something with Gina's logo on it, and I had a few slides in here tonight that had the Voter Access and Engagement Initiative on it, you can feel good about sharing that information because Professor McClendon is not putting anything out there that hasn't been vetted and isn't accurate. Right? The League of Women Voters is a trusted source. But you can also always call 866-OUR-VOTE and say, is this accurate in my state? You know, so often many of the things that lead to confusion are well-intended. You know, we had a situation here in a month or two ago where there was a big meme that was going out through all online on social media saying, request a mail-in ballot, but then go turn it in person and you don't have to do it with the mail. And that may work great in Massachusetts, but it doesn't in Missouri because Missouri has a law that says mail-in ballots can only be returned by mail, right? Or in some places, you know, what I think you're going to see a lot of going forward before Election Day are things like, oh, you can just make sure your ballot's postmarked by Election Day. Well, that's not true in Missouri. In Missouri, it has to be received by Election Day. So, and even when we mean well, anytime we repost stuff, we amplify it. So the other thing that I think is something that we're sort of inclined to do, and I know that I can get sucked into this too. This is where some of this foreign interference comes in. You see something that's crazy, that's outrageous, you know, just inaccurate information about absentee ballots. Absentee ballots are all fraudulent, you know, and you're like, oh my gosh, this is ridiculous. Can you believe they said this? Right? And then you repost and repost and repost. That original post is getting amplified each time you do that on the social media site's algorithms, and you're actually contributing to promoting that misinformation rather than stopping it. And so, you know, the people that, I mean, so some of this is unintentional, just like the misinformation, you know, like just things that are different from state to state. And some of it is intentional and is designed to get your goat so that you're like, I can't believe this, blah, blah, blah. And then you become an unwitting partner in that foreign interference and in that misinformation. So like, as hard as it is to like, just don't engage. You know, it's like we tell people at the polls, like, don't engage with it. There are other ways we can report to sites like Junkopedia. Here in Missouri, we have an easy to use link that we can use to report misinformation that I'll be happy to share with folks. And I'd be happy to share as well our social media monitoring trainings, including one that was conducted at Washington University, sponsored by the Voter Access and Engagement Initiative.
Wow, that's very useful. And yeah, it's so insightful what you said about, you know, just even engaging with potentially misinformation could really amplify it. I think a lot of people don't think about that when they do engage with these things on social media. And I guess attached to that point, as it relates to expanding the franchise in Missouri, there's so many different state laws everywhere. You know, every state has different laws as it relates to voting. And I think this has put that in the spotlight, coronavirus and 2020, about how complex voting can actually get. I mean, people have already experienced the complexities of voting in the past, but I think now it's kind of come to the fore, even in people's minds who potentially never even thought about it before. So I guess what's kind of the future? What are some policy avenues that people should be aware of for the increase of the franchise in the state of Missouri? What are some pertinent policy areas for that?
Oh, Louis, that's such a great question. I'm so glad that you asked it. You know, because I think that this year has been just unusual in pretty much every possible way. But among other things, I think that the challenges imposed on voting because of the coronavirus have really allowed people to see just how limited some of Missouri's laws are. You know, the truth of the matter is that Missouri is really behind the scenes, kind of an outlier compared to other states in access that it provides to voting. So one of the reasons that this whole process of voting by mail in Missouri is so confusing is because we have a really restrictive rule about how people can vote absentee. The truth is, the vast majority of states, 34 states plus the District of Columbia, allow any voter, anytime, to vote absentee for any reason. The government doesn't care what your reason is. Here in Missouri, you have to list one of, up until this year, 6 specific reasons. We have a 7th added for this year. It's going to expire at the end of this year due to COVID. And that's really limiting. Lots of people may need to vote absentee before Election Day, particularly people that already have other barriers to the ballot, you know, low-wage workers, shift workers, hourly wage workers who can't afford to take the day off, people that rely on public transportation, people who are caring for children and elderly parents. I mean, there's a whole lot of reason that that Tuesday in November is really not a good time, and Missouri makes it very, very difficult to vote at any time outside of Election Day. We should be joining the vast majority of states that allow any voter to vote absentee for any reason. If we had that, we would not be nearly in the state that we are in this year. And I think people sort of are seeing that for the first time in Missouri because lots of voters are wanting to vote before Election Day for the very first time. I think they're also seeing some of the challenges by the fact that we just don't have early voting in Missouri. Challenges updating their registrations. Every election, we end up having to work with people who can't vote because they moved close by, but never updated their registrations. There's got to be a better way. You know, they figure out how to forward your mail, right? They figure out how to, the IRS knows how to find you if you move across town. Your election board, it's all in a statewide database. There's absolutely no reason that when you complete a change of address that doesn't update automatically your voter registration. And these are things that again, the majority of states are already working on. Lots of states, when it comes to young people, allow the pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds. And so even though 16, 17-year-olds can't vote in those places, when you're 16, that's typically when you go to get the driver's license. And the DMV is a place that's required to ask you to register to vote. Well, here in Missouri, they don't ask people who are 16 or 17. Those folks get their driver's licenses. 2 years later, they turn 18. They're not going back to the DMV for another 5 years. And unless they're lucky enough to be on a college campus like WashU that puts so much effort and resources into voter registration drives, they're not likely to have access to voter registration. The states that allow pre-registration, again, you get your driver's license, your name goes into the queue, and when you turn 18, bam, you get added to the rolls. There's so many things that are really quite simple, quite basic, that many, many other states are doing that that we need to be moving forward on. And I do think that the challenges in voting that this year has presented have made people realize that we need to make some changes.
Thank you for that. And I surely do believe that's the case. Just even as it comes to those simple disparities in laws within the United States, it's kind of something that, again, some of those memes, some of those online, national campaigns that, again, people are thinking that this is good information. People realize, wow, every state has different ways of approaching this, and some people may have never thought of that prior to this. Just real quick, there's so many things we could talk to you about, but we have limited time. We know about the election, the presidential election. I think that this is not news to anyone, but there's other things in the St. Louis and St. Louis area and Missouri ballots that potentially people may not be as aware of. What are some of those things on the ballot that we should be looking for if we have not already voted, and potentially look up ahead of time so that we are aware of what we're going to see on the ballot?
Well, I think that the most confusing thing, ballot measure on the ballot, is Amendment 3. And it's a very, very important one as well if you care about democracy. When you read the language that you'll see on the ballot, it appears that it's about limiting corporate gifts from lobbyists. But the truth of the matter is that it's actually something that completely changes the way we draw district lines in a way that is going to dilute minority representation, particularly African American, Latino, and Asian American voters, and make it much harder to challenge discriminatory maps in court. You know, Missouri voters passed a constitutional amendment by wide margin, like 2-1 in 2018, called Clean Missouri. And it did something really kind of incredible. I said Missouri was the outlier in a bad way on voting rights. This one actually was really positive. It established a nonpartisan demographer to draw district lines to ensure they were more competitive and to ensure fairer representation. And it actually made Missouri a leader in this across Missouri. This measure would undo that. It would put map drawing back in the hands of partisan actors. It would also eliminate the transparency process. It would allow that process now to happen behind closed doors instead of being open to the public. And even worse, it would not count major segments of the population for purposes of drawing district lines. And it would only count voting age population. It would not count non-citizens or people under 18. Well, this is not done anywhere else in the country. We count all residents in a district for purposes of drawing district lines, because whether you are a citizen or a non-citizen, you still drive down the roads. Even if you're under 18, you go to school, right? You may be eligible for government services and programs, and the way that these lines are drawn dictate that and dictate the kind of representation you have, because, right, we decide how many representatives you get based on total population. So the larger a population, the more people you might have representing you. And it turns out that if you eliminate people under 18 and non-citizens, you cut off a significant portion of representation for voters of color compared to white voters. In other words, a much smaller number of white people are under the age of 18. White people are generally older. An enormous proportion of Latino people are under 18. And so now, not only do you have, like, can you draw lines in a way that doesn't allow them to elect candidates of their choice, but you're cutting down the number of representation in half in some cases. With African American and Asian American voters, you're cutting it down by like 25%. It's dramatic. So you are significantly reducing the amount of representation that African American, Latino, and Asian American populations get, on top of allowing those maps to be drawn in a way so that they're not competitive and they don't really allow the communities to elect candidates of their choice. And the third thing that Amendment 3 does is it changes the standard for how you can challenge discriminatory districting lines in court. So it would leave them really without even the opportunity to go to court. So Amendment 3, I think, is the one to really look at and read into more. For other measures on the ballot, I would really encourage you to check out the League of Women Voters Voter Guide. They're totally nonpartisan, and it breaks down that legal language into just more accessible kind of explanations of what does this do. And you can access their voter guide at vote411.org.
Wow, thank you so much for just, I know you can only touch on that one amendment, although there's that constitutional amendment, although there's so many things that maybe voters should be aware of, especially in the St. Louis area. But I really appreciate everything you were able to share with us today. We're gonna go ahead and wrap up. We are close to time. I just want to thank you, Denise, for joining us today with all the information that you shared. We at Gephardt really do put a premium on the importance of the franchise on voting. This is not the sole means of exercising civic engagement in society. By no means is this the sole means. However, we believe at Gephardt that this is an important means of creating change in society, and one of the ones that should actually be focused on potentially a little bit at the higher end of the priority spectrum, because this is the one that elects people who make those legal decisions, who change those lines and make those critical decisions at all levels. Everything from judges to the Constitution to different propositions on taxes to elected officials. We are covering so many things through voting, and so we at Gephardt want to just emphasize that we believe that voting is important. We also believe in the importance of relational organizing, and that's critical that people not just vote, but they tell their friends to vote, they tell their families to vote, and they help them vote in an accurate and a safe way that's going to get their vote counted and make sure that their voice is heard, especially for those folks who may come from marginalized communities and backgrounds. So as a closing activity, we just want to ask a question for anyone who's watching this or who will watch the recording. What are you committing to between now and election day to help to make sure the community around you can successfully vote? So if you voted, how can you help others vote as well? And if you have not voted but will vote, how can you assist those that you'll impact with voting? And you can see there on the screen, election protection. So go ahead and if you're watching this recording or if you're watching this now, you can freeze the screen, go ahead and pull that number off, election protection. You can call 1-866-OUR-VOTE and connect with the staff that Denise Lieberman has put together over there. Thank you so much, Denise. We want to thank you again for joining us tonight, this evening, and thank you everyone for joining us as well.
Thank you so much to the Gephardt Institute, to the Voter Access and Engagement Initiative, to all of the groups and organizations at Washington University that help ensure that there's robust research as well as student and voter engagement and the right to vote.